It's a very
Okay, we should try and regroup. I think it's pretty obvious that there's a need for these conversations, these discussions to happen in the future. Hannes, Brits, and I, and Hope, and others have been talking about future conferences. I had to wait for the big cheese to get here before I could propose this. Accessibility. But my program, the School of Information Sciences at the University of Tennessee, and the School of Information Studies here at Milwaukee have a formal memorandum of understanding. We've had that memorandum of understanding for, I think, almost 2 years, along with the Carey University in Uganda. But in any event, under the auspices of that memorandum of understanding, I think Hans and I and others hope will be talking about the possibility of moving the conference, perhaps on a rotating basis, to my campus in Knoxville. Certainly, we would be excited to host the conference. In his paper, IOEthics Smiraglia poses a central question. Do present-day schemas for resource description restrict access by constraining objectivity? Richard will be a visiting professor here at the School of Information Studies from starting in August. He comes to Milwaukee from Long Island University and Columbia University. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago, among other degrees. He's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Knowledge Organization and a frequent author on the problems of instantiation in works. His most recent research is in domain analysis and knowledge visualization. Thank you, Richard, for participating in the conference. New toy to play with. So over the last many decades, I have taught legions of people how to catalog. And I've always tried to convey to them a sense of responsibility, and I guess that in that is my sense of ethics in resource description, and it always focused for me around the problem of objectivity. If you describe what you have and describe it well, then you have done your job well. Now, during those decades, I also have made a lot of fun out of the cataloging rules. And one of the things that I've enjoyed very much is the number of rules that I like to make fun of that have gone away in that time, because my students have graduated and joined ALA and gotten on the committee and gotten the rules changed. So I have fewer rules to complain about today than I would have had 30 years ago. But I still have plenty of material, so don't worry. But I began to understand, as I prepared to submit an abstract for this conference, that there is an ethical stance in resource description, and that stance is somehow related to this concept of bibliocentrism, which is, like other isms, something that is pervasive. It is so pervasive in knowledge organization that most of us engage in it unconsciously. We take part, like other kinds of isms, like sexism and racism and so forth. We take part willingly because it's the role we learn. And so we play our part in keeping bibliocentrism firmly established, firmly ensconced in the rules for knowledge, for resource description. And so what I'm going to try to do is just show you a few examples of how that plays out. See how we do. There is, of course, what I call a historic pendulum swing in resource description. We Go back to Charles Cutter, because you know we're supposed to. You can't talk about cataloging unless you quote Cutter. As you all know, Cutter said that we should consider the convenience of the public and consider that not over against, but together with the ease of the cataloger. In other words, we should make a good pragmatic decision about how to proceed based on both of those points firmly in mind. But as a matter of fact, we've never really done that. Our cataloging rules have typically been generated, I say in my paper, I say rather politely that they are oddly rationalized, pragmatic constructs. What I mean is a bunch of people sit around a table and say, hey, what if we do it this way? And so there is no evidence brought to bear on the problem or the construction of the rules for resource description. There's no evidence about the resources being described, and there's no evidence about the user groups for whom those resources might be of value. And as a result, our pragmatic or rationalized sets of rules tend to follow this pendulum swing from Jewett, who said famously that there would be a much higher degree of uniformity brought to bear if the cataloger was not allowed to exercise any judgment. Nothing, so far as can be avoided, should be left to the individual judgment of the cataloger. This will bring about uniformity because everyone will simply follow the rules. And then we go to Osborne, a generation or two later, who said, "No goodness, folks, we can't get anything done here, so let's go back to Cutter and let's be pragmatists and let's consider the ease of the cataloger and the convenience of the public and consider those together." And so we have this pendulum swinging back and forth, scribing an arc, but never once touching empirical evidence on its way, and only rarely leading to common sense. To wit, at the bottom of this slide, you have my favorite example, of which I may still make fun, Skashai Fasavita, which is, of course, the way the Tchaikovsky Ballet of Sleeping Beauty is well known to the American public. The Anglo-American cataloging rules require us to use the name of the composer in the form in which it is most commonly understood by readers in our country, which is now defined as the form you'll find in English-speaking reference sources. And so for Tchaikovsky, who was Russian, we use the French form of his name. Are you still with me here? We use the French form of his name because it's most commonly found in English language reference books, such as the Encyclopedia Britannica. But then we go to the rule for uniform title, which says, use the title by which the composer first formulated it in his own language. When we first wrote ACR2, the rule was use the composer's original title. And I was saying to Janet last night, this was, I was imagining requisitions of Ouija boards for catalog departments everywhere. Because how else would we ever know what the composers had intended? All right, so our very pragmatic rules do not let us come to a reasonable conclusion in this one case. We render the name in a form that's easily understandable to our users, and then we make the work completely weird. So, theoretical commitment, then, in resource description, I think should rely on a reflection of empirical theory in the design and application of rules. What I mean is we should consider those activities by which we accomplish resource description, and we should consider each of those activities along the continuum of why are we doing this and who is it going to serve. And my famous first question always is, what is the theoretical basis for title page transcription? Well, the reason we transcribe the title page is A, because we always have, and B, because in the 17th century that was really a good way of getting a picture of the document into the catalog. But this isn't the 17th century any longer, so why do we still transcribe? And why are the rules for transcription this thick? when all we really need to do is click on Amazon.com and see how they do it better. It's just like ordering a sweater from Land's End. You want to see a picture of it. You want to turn it around so you can see what it looks like. The other way around, you want to make it bigger if you need glasses to see the little image on the screen and so forth. That's what that bit of the catalog should be about. So by what theoretical yardstick then do we spend all of this money transcribing title pages? So that's one of my tenets here. Another is, as I said before, the whole concept of bibliocentrism. This is a bibliographic Orwellian melange. All resources are equal, except some are more equal than the others. By which I mean books are good and everything else is not. And we set up the catalog according to that standard. Books are good and non-books are not books. And therefore we warn the user, warn, mind you, not alert, but warn the user that's not a book. You don't really want this thing. And we set up rules for resource description that say this is an item that contains a monograph that is of a certain length. I'll show you an example of that later. But instead we just consider that books are good and everything else has some subsidiary rules because they're all bad. We also need to engage user requirements, and this is where Claire Begtal has so usefully pointed us toward cultural warrant. We need to consider not just specific query needs of user groups, but rather how particular documents might be used to provide exploitative power. Exploitative power, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the terms from Patrick Wilson's Two Kinds of Power. He says that the reason we bother with all of this description is to allow people to exploit knowledge. By exploiting knowledge, he means not just reading it, but taking it and using it to make new knowledge, to make life better, to increase happiness, or to make human condition better. That's exploitative power. And exploitative power comes not from simple result sets in an online catalog, but rather from the ability to find things that otherwise might not fall together and put them together and make sense of them. So whenever we are not engaging in exploitative power, we are violating cultural warrant. And the last piece of this puzzle is from Hurlin, or I take from Hurlin, and that's the whole notion of activity theory, which I think is consonant with Claire's notion of cultural warrant. We must consider how a document is potentially useful in order to understand how to describe it. So, there, I covered all that already. Good. So, what I've done is undertake a small case study here, and I want just to show you what happens if we look at a set of resources and consider how they might be useful, and then look at the descriptions that have been produced by the Library of Congress. I'm happy to say I was not able to find Library of Congress descriptions for everything, so this will not be a total LC bashing moment. And I'm not really bashing the Library of Congress as I go, so don't tell them that I do that. So I have three biographies, one of FDR, one of LBJ, and one of Jesus, and that's really quite a set. And I want to show you what happens when you treat three completely different things as though they were all identical. And then I have a bunch of bad things, non-books, some videos and sound and music. So here we go. FDR, a biography by Ted Morgan, is a celebrated book that reports FDR's preparation for his life in politics. It is not so much a history of his time as president as it is a history of the time in which he was born and in which he grew up. And so there's quite a lot of primary material cited in this biography. If you were interested in the milieu into which FDR was born, this book would lead you to the archives where you could learn more about that time. The Newport scandal, for instance, is a whole chapter in here about a gay scandal in which FDR was involved as Secretary of the Navy that took place in Newport, Rhode Island in 1919. Now, you all know about that, right? No, we've never heard of this. And why is it well, I don't know why we've never heard of this, but maybe because it's always obscured by resource description. But here's a whole chapter about this. Now what I've done in the corner there is give you the table of contents. The book is not hiding this from us, it's the resource description. Here is the Library of Congress record for that, and let me just go to this screen so you can see what a wonderful resource description we have here. We have transcription of the title page and the total number of pages, and that wonderful word P of plates. And that's about it. So here's a case in which the resource description is essentially useless. Enough said. Here's Reaching for Glory. Reaching for Glory is a part of a series of books produced from the tapes that LBJ had under his desk. He had a tape machine. Everyone thinks it was Nixon's idea, but LBJ started it. And he recorded every word that was said, not just in the Oval Office, but in his bedroom. There's a whole set of, right after he took office, there are a whole set of conversations he and Lady Bird had from their apartment in the White House with Jackie, who clearly was horrified that LBJ and Lady Bird were calling her at 11 o'clock at night. And those are wonderful if you like that sort of thing. Here's just an example. Lady Bird has invited her doctors to the White House for dinner because she thinks LBJ is working too hard, and she didn't tell him that's what was going on, so they all sat there and stared at him through dinner so that afterward she could find out whether they thought he was in fact about to pop off. And she says, "My dear friends Jim and Willis Hurst are house guests, and this morning they completed the purpose of their visit, an examination of Lyndon. Essentially everything is fine, all the basic organs and so forth, but there is this heavy tension and fog of depression." And on and on she goes. All this has been recorded. Now, this is primary source material about the LBJ presidency, but also about the period of the time after the JFK assassination, about the Vietnam War, and about the 1960s, all times through which I lived. I'm that old. Anyway, we have, in this case, a bibliographic record that does include sort of a table of contents. And so we have a little bit better description here. I'm not sure why. Someone at the Library of Congress must have sneaked in that contents note, because the rule interpretation wouldn't have permitted it. Now here's my third one, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography by Dominic Crossan. As you know, this is not based on newly discovered primary sources, but based on the typical four Gospels and everybody's Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this also is really not a biography at all. What this is a story about the time contemporaneous with Jesus of Nazareth, and this is done from archaeological evidence of the day and from Crossan's own theological experience. And so the resource description really has to convey the notion that what we have here is not a story about Jesus at all, but a story about life in the Middle East in that period. And the table of contents gives you some of that flavor. You see, I didn't do a good job with this. This slide that you can't see right here, the headline is, "It is a girl, if it is a girl, cast it out," and that's about the practice of taking newborn girl babies out into the desert to die because boy babies were better, and so on and so on. Here on the right is information about the difference in that period between illness and disease. Disease is something, he says, between me, my doctor, and a bug, something's wrong with my body. But illness is something for which you are cast out from the culture. That's quite a different thing. So, for instance, when the gospel tells us that someone has been healed, it does not mean that their disease has been stopped, but rather that they have been allowed to return to the table with the family. And so the whole book is full of anthropological information of that sort. As usual, we have a title page transcription as the resource description. Now, this bibliographic record does, as a matter of fact, point to, have a URL that points to the blurb that appears in this little blue box. You can't read it. That says this is a an archaeological excursion. Well, those are my 3 biographies. Those are the good things. These are the non-good things. These are not books. We have the French Chef 2, a series of DVDs of the Julia Child series. And we have the Proof, which is a videotape. Both of those are from public broadcasting. The Proof is about the solving of Fermat's last theorem. As you can see, we have absolutely no information at all on the containers, so there's not much point to transcription. On the right, I have the Clavier Büchlein for Wilhelm Friedman Bach, which is one of J.S. Bach's famous keyboard works. And what we have here is an edited edition from the Bach, not the Werkverzeichnis, the Sämtliche Werke. It's the collected works of Bach, and the editions are heavily edited, and the sources are also shown in the volume, so you can see Bach's hand as well as the music in modern edited form. And then we have here the collected recordings of Billie Holiday. Now, the Julia Child DVD had no cataloging at the Library of Congress, and I have no reasonable explanation for that other than they must not cook while they're cataloging it, I see. But this record is actually not bad. This conforms to the instructions that most catalogers of videos would give you, which are to transcribe the titles of the individual shows. And that does give us more information than we would have had from the labels of the discs themselves, or even from the box. We also have a summary note telling us that this was a television program, French Chef, and so forth. On the other hand, it doesn't tell us what to do when you drop the chicken on the floor and the guests are hungry. Fermat's last theorem has also, this is an LC record. It does not have a summary note or tell us anything about this other than the title of the program and its column. And Billie Holiday, and you see that extensive bibliographic description there. This is a 3-volume set, and in each volume there is a booklet in the jewel box with program notes about the recordings, where they were made, what was going on in her life at that time, and so on. None of that is captured for us. Now, here is where we see cultural warmth at work. Music cataloging rules have been in development from the music librarianship community since the late 19th century. And those rules were primarily developed by practitioners, not by librarians, but by musicologists and composers and people in the music business who were going to use the descriptions to find their resources easily. And so what we see here is an extensive description. This is from a German library in LCLC, and this reflects the needs of the music community, having declared exactly how they wanted the cataloging to be different. This is how music cataloging was done, typically until with AACR2 the rules were coordinated into a single volume, and at that point the Music Library Association went to war with the American Library Association and lost, and so a lot of the detail that is in the Music Library Association Code that was produced in the 60s and the International Association for Music Libraries Code produced in the 70s, a lot of that does not appear in the rules that we use for resource description. But this is a case where a community's own warrant has been taken into consideration. So where does that leave us? Blank slide. All right, so transcription from the chief source is not helpful for users. It's better to replace that with an image, and it's probably easy to replace that with an image, and thereby reduce our reliance on legions of my former students all transcribing title pages. Contents notes are critical, but they are prescribed by the Library of Congress rule interpretations. GMDs and SMDs we have to ask ourselves whether those represent equality or the warning a bad resource is ahead, and so forth. This is the non-bibliocentric way to describe a book, not just give the number of pages, but at least in the language in AACR 2. Now I want to go back to Cutter, since I began with Cutter, and notice that in the appendix to the 1906 edition of his rules, he got carried away and referred to what he called the cult of the title page, which he says has overwhelmed everything and made its way into library cataloging. And so even Cutter has told us to turn our back on the cult of the title page. Okay, cultural warrant would suggest that we try to produce useful and user-centered descriptions, such as the one you saw for the Clary Buchlein. The absence of cultural warrant leaves us in a use and user-oriented gap, represented by the notion that a book is a book is a book. And it doesn't matter how we describe it as long as we transcribe the title page adequately. Now, let's take it a step further. Let's abandon the cult of the title page. Let's abandon multi-tiered bibliocentricity in the library catalog. Let's not transcribe despite the potential usefulness of the document, but let us do take on the incorporation of digitized images and hyperlink inherent details from the contents of the resources. Now, if you think that's wild, I have an even wilder idea for you, except it wasn't my idea. It comes from the Belgian prophet Paul Adley, who thought that the catalog should resemble this machine you see down there on the left that's called the grinder. And all the documents go into the grinder, and the grinder grinds them up. And out the bottom, it's a little train you see going into the cars of the train, are the facts that were in the resources, now being spit out in pure form so that they can be individually indexed. Facts disassembled and hyperlinked is another potential future. Thank you very much.
Either I misunderstood, or early on you said that because the bib record for the FDR book did not specifically mention the Newport scandal, therefore the bib record for the FDR book was not useful?
The bibliographic record doesn't mention any of the contents, it just says FDR / and the author's name.
Are you talking about the whole bib record, or just the 245?
The whole bibliographic record. There's no contents note, there's no summary, there's no pointer to the content of the volume.
Okay, so the subject headings you don't find them useful, the physical description you don't find it useful. I'm sorry, this is so elementary, but I really don't understand where you're coming from here.
Well, I'm not talking about subject headings, so
okay.
That's just a limitation of my presentation.
Okay. So you're...
but I don't find that particularly helpful. I knew that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the subject of a book called FDR. And I knew that he was president, but that's not a subject heading that's going to lead me to any of the detailed content. Americans would do well to study the time of his presidency. He was sick the entire time, and the public was never aware of that. That was kept from them. He was elected to 4 terms and served through them. I think it's a remarkable period, and people would do well to know more about it. But I'm just trying to say this. I'm not sure for whom the bibliographic record was produced, but I don't find it very helpful.
First, I just want to say I do really like how you talk about the perceived needs of the public instead of just talking about the needs of the public, because my experience has been, I think a lot of times what we think they need is not what they feel they need. And that goes not just for catalogers, but for public service librarians as well. But my next question had to do with the very end of your presentation. You talked about hyperlinking. You're talking about hyperlinking to the publisher's website about the book. What would we hyperlink to exactly? And I know this is such a librarian question, but how can we guarantee that information isn't going to just disappear from the publisher's website?
Well, we have all those legions of former students of mine. Now they're sitting inside that grinder machine.
Yes.
And they're updating links all day. I'm making a joke there.
Oh.
I think that we're moving into, I mean, it's 2009, we're not moving into, we have moved into a digital environment. And so we have to live in the environment where we find ourselves. I think that I've just moved my office from New York to Pennsylvania, and I've thrown away 35 years of Xeroxes because I don't need them anymore, because all I have to do is type something into Google and up pops a PDF. So most of the content that's useful for me as a scholar is available in online form. So that's the sort of hyperlink I'm implying. You're correct, I did not say that explicitly, that our tools should make. Yes, also the publisher's resources, but also to the content of the volume itself in digital form.
So we should go ahead and start digitizing this information?
Well, I think we will soon be buying these volumes in digital form.
Okay.
Talk a little bit about the pendulum between rules and principles-based cataloging. Talk about where you think the good balance is.
Where the good balance is?
Yeah, actually not.
Well, I was saving this for the panel this afternoon. But I told Janet last night, I was listening to her paper yesterday, and I just kept shaking my head because I'm the one in the room who worked for Michael Gorman during the implementation of AACR2. And, it was not pretty. I think that what I remember Michael saying famously to all of us lying catalogers in the day was sit down, shut up, and catalog. And he was very rude, but he meant it. And it's really good advice. And, you just have to stop fretting, oh, what if I put the comma in the wrong place? And just get on with it. And I think that Osborne had it right. The problem with that is it's really hard for human beings to be that pragmatic and to exercise judgment at that level. I heard a couple of you talking yesterday about cataloging things you're not familiar with. I was a music librarian, and I had to have degrees in music, and I was steeped in music. I had been a musician for 2 decades at the point that I became a music cataloger, and I could not imagine having done my job without that background in music. I would get something on my desk that said Air by Bach, and that was the only clue I had to what it was, except I could read the tune, da-da-da-da-da. So then I'd have to go out and figure out what da-da-da-da-da was in order to identify the word. You have to have domain knowledge, that's the way we would say that today, to function pragmatically in that environment. So the ethical consideration there goes in several directions. Schools of Library and Information Science who are producing professionals who will exercise pragmatic judgment need to bear in mind that people who are going to be hired as specialists need to have that specialist background as well. That suggests dual degrees for academic catalogers.
This is more like a couple of observations. First of all, I can hardly wait for the Legion to march across the United States from one catalog to all those who need it. This is sort of an insourcing instead of outsourcing. Here comes this Legion. And we'll import them. We need them for a bunch of things we're currently buying. But I was also reminded of a paper that Fred Nisa wrote a number of years ago about how cataloging rules are written, which he described as retrospective. It's ex post facto. That is to say, you develop a body of practice, and after a while you say, wait, is there a unifying rule? Or is there a unifying principle at work here? Then you identify the principle and say, that's why we did it this way. I'm not sure we're ever going to get away from that, but what do you think?
I think that that's a political question. I mean, the question in my mind is how would we get away from that? We were talking last night about 2123C, which is the rule for the main entry for sound recording in APCR2. When I became the person on CCDA, that rule clearly was not functional, and we had to rewrite it. And what we did was we went to the library where I worked at Urbana. We took a random sample, and by which I mean a random sample, properly constructed, of sound recordings, and we transcribed their titles, and we measured the proportions and the term co-occurrence to see if it's this kind of music, what kind of title does it have, and how is the title phrase structured. And then we took a pragmatic rule back to CCDA and had it added. So the rule you're all using now, that might sound funny to you, it says if it's not Western art music, put it under its title. And if it is Western art music, put it under the composer. That rule is actually based on empirical evidence. And I tell you that story because we have lots and lots of empirical evidence about what is held by libraries and how it is similar from collection to collection or how it is dissimilar. And that evidence could be brought to bear on these questions. The same thing happened, come to think of it, with the rule for pseudonyms. When we went back to using, saying, yes, if there are 18 pseudonyms, use them all. Because we had by then empirical evidence that suggested, A, that was easier for the user, and B, that over a period of about 70 years, they all become known as pseudonyms of a name. So after we've retired, the next group can bring them all together under the original name. But I think we have that kind of evidence, and what we don't have is easily ascertained. Now, how do we convince the rule-making bodies to base the rules on evidence? You know, when I go to the doctor and say, this hurts, and he gives me a pill, he's not because they're all sitting around the back saying, it's because there's science to back up his decision.
I just have a broader question. Thank you for your presentation, Richard. That's, in my field of ethics, and I'm not a cataloger, I've never teach it, but I did very well in my studies because I had to pass it. Joost de Moor, the Dutch philosopher, he argued that the biggest change in the information field after the printing press was not the computer or digitization, but the camera. Because suddenly we could change from reflecting on reality not with text and words, but by capturing reality as it is by camera. And then digitization came with digital cameras, and suddenly the whole world has become an information world based on visualization, not anymore text-based. So I was wondering, how does that feed back into the cataloging field? Because I think, and I say I'm not a cataloger, but I think if I hear people say book is not a book, if it's a book, it's all text-based arguments. Now I know that you have pictures and you have in museums where you catalog visual and more emblems or whatever. But the world in the future is going to be much more a visual world and an oral world than a text-based world. Is that anything? Is it a question that you can ask for cataloging, or is it something that you already has dealt with? What are the ethical issues when you are limited to text in cataloging versus the broader notion of a visual digital world? I don't know if my question even makes sense, because that triggers me a lot, that the world out there is not anymore a text-based world. The way we interact with reality is a visual, digitized world, which is less text. And I think cataloging is very much based on the printing press, and not the camera as inventions.
We can have another hour, is that it? Well, there's no doubt that the catalog, as we know it, is too complex. It's way too complex, and therefore there is an ethical dilemma there. We're spending our resources in a useless manner, and we could be spending the same resources on something like the grinder or some other fantastic tool in the future. I have done a lot of work of late with meta language for cultural heritage resources, and that it's hard to explain it in less than 3 or 4 hours, but it's a language that doesn't describe the resources in terms of their being, but rather in terms of their structure and their where they came from and how they came to be. And what you get is an underlying structure that reveals similarity that's not semantic. And I think there are a lot of approaches like that that could take what comes out of the grinder and make much better use of it than what we're doing in the catalog today.
One more here? Sorry.
So, quick question. As an academic, as an administrator in an academic library, what do I go back and tell my catalogers about how to catalog
Well, if I could only get one soundbite, I would urge pragmatism and pragmatic use of judgment, in particular with regard to cultural warrant and user domain specific needs. Do you want me to put that in English? Transcribe contents, notes, and hyperlink whenever possible.
Okay, the last break, which was an unscheduled break, from 5 minutes stretched to 10 minutes. So why don't we shrink this break from 15 to 10 as a compromise? We'll take a 10-minute break.